And after a long year of lessons, we finally reach our last unit, and that is Unit 9, Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, or Come Together Right Now. Yes, indeed. Let's do it. So let's start by defining the term Reconstruction. This is the era after the Civil War from 1865 to 1877. And the goals for Reconstruction, like we stated before, are to rejoin the former Confederate states with the Union, to reunite the South with the northern and western states of the Union. And while it was not part of his initial goal in fighting the Civil War, remember Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he said that he did not wish to abolish slavery, but over the course of the war he realized that the American society had to move beyond slavery. He passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and that he realized that society was going to have to change, and that from now on slavery would be abolished in the United States. He also wanted to find a compassionate and caring way to bring the South into the Union. If you look at this quote here from his second inaugural address, we discussed this a little bit, that he did not want to see the South punished, but again, he wanted to make the country whole again. So let's look at our TEKS for Lesson 40, entitled Presidential Reconstruction. First of all, we always want to be able to identify our main terms and to put those events in order. We can evaluate Reconstruction reform legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We can explain the economic, social, and political problems during Reconstruction and how these affected different groups. And finally, that we can describe the importance of the 13th and 14th Amendments on life in the U.S. And guys, 13th, 14th, and later 15th Amendments are important lessons from this unit. We can think of the years of Reconstruction as having taken place in three phases. And the first of these, Phase 1, is called Presidential Reconstruction because this phase was led by the presidents. Now, Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was very generous in terms for the South. It only was going to require 10% of former Confederates within a Confederate state to pledge loyalty to the Union. Each of the former states in the Confederacy had to rewrite their state constitutions in which they banned slavery. It also created the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was a federal agency designed to assist former slaves. Again, remember that they had spent their entire lives living in plantations. Many of them were uneducated. They had been separated from their families, and they were in great need of assistance to continue their lives now as freedmen. So the Freedmen's Bureau provided supplies, food, medicine, clothing. It set up hospitals, and one of the most important things it did was it set up schools to begin to educate the African American population. At the beginning of Reconstruction, there were three political groups in play here. The first of these is the Democrats, and they were mostly from the South and the West, although there were also some Northern Democrats. They wanted to mostly let the states handle their own affairs without federal interference. So they were largely, now that the war was over, they more or less wanted to let the Southern states go about their business as long as they followed some basic directives in Lincoln's plan. Then you have the Republicans, and these are the moderates, and this is really Lincoln's group. They wanted a minimum federal role, for example, the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau like we saw, but they did not want a very strong hand in the South. And then you have a third group. These are the radical Republicans. These are mostly from the North and the Northeast especially, and they wanted a very active federal role in Reconstruction. This is the group that really wanted to see the South punished and wanted to see some retribution for what had gone on during the Civil War. One of the leaders of the radical Republicans was Charles Sumner. You remember, he's the one who was almost beaten to death by Preston Brooks on the Senate floor. They also wanted to grant full citizenship for all, including African Americans, and they wanted non-Confederates to lead the South, people who had not been involved with the Confederacy. Now, as we learned in Lesson 39, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth and died the next morning. So he was not going to be able to fulfill his plan for Reconstruction. That job fell to his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who became the 17th president. Now, Johnson was chosen as a compromise candidate to run with Lincoln and help balance his ticket and his appeal. So Johnson was a very different politician. First of all, he was a Democrat, not a Republican. He came from Tennessee, a slave state. In fact, he was a former slave owner. He was very stubborn and strong-willed, and he lacked Lincoln's political skills and tolerance. However, he did believe in Lincoln's Reconstruction plan and vowed that he would continue with Lincoln's plan to restore the Union. Now, during Lincoln's last months in office, the 13th Amendment had been proposed by Congress actually, and it went out to the states for ratification, which it was ratified in December 1865. So the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution. This amendment made slavery illegal in the U.S. And if you look at the text here, Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. So Johnson required the Southern states to, first of all, ratify the 13th Amendment, and they had to accept federal authority over the states, because if you remember, that was part of the cause of the Civil War, was the South's insistence on states' rights over federal authority. Remember the nullification crisis back with South Carolina. And if they would do so, he offered to pardon former Confederates. Now this was important because this would restore their citizenship rights and their voting rights. However, even with the generous terms of Lincoln's and then Johnson's plan, many of the Southern states continued to resist reforms. Some of them refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, and they made few changes to their state governments. The quote you see right here is actually from one of the governors of the former Confederate states. This is a white man's government intended for white men only. They passed what were called black codes, and these were laws that were intended to limit freedmen's rights. African Americans, first of all, had to carry documentation in which they had proof of their employment. They restricted their rights to vote, to carry guns, to drink alcohol, or to meet in groups. And really what the black codes were intended to do was this was sort of a way to force many of the former slaves to stay on plantations and to continue to work for the plantation owners. And this proved to many Northerners that the South was unwilling to reform itself and that it would take a much firmer hand if anything was going to change in the South. Under the terms of Reconstruction, Johnson did allow many Southerners to be pardoned and gave them their voting rights, so the Southern states passed their new state constitutions, and they elected new representatives to the U.S. Congress. However, for the most part, most of these leaders were former Confederates and were the same people who, in fact, had pushed for and voted for secession. So the Congress, made up of Northern congressmen, refused to seat these former Confederates elected by the Southern states. And they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, in which they said that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens and that they are guaranteed their equal rights regardless of race. So this was an act aimed specifically at granting African American full civil rights in the U.S. However, President Johnson vetoed the act. Remember, he's a former slave owner, a Democrat, and he does not believe in racial equality. And so he strongly opposed this act. However, this was overridden by Congress. So let's go back to our study of government. How many votes does it require to override a veto? You got it, 2/3. So 2/3 of the Congress voted to override this veto and pass the Civil Rights Act. However, many believe that simply having a law or an act passed by Congress was not enough, and Congress wanted citizenship to be guaranteed as part of the Constitution. So in 1866, they proposed the 14th Amendment, and in this amendment, all persons born in the U.S. or who are naturalized are citizens, and that states cannot deny them their constitutional rights to due process. What the 14th Amendment says is that if you were born on American soil, or that one or both parents are already American citizens, or if you were duly naturalized in the naturalization process, then you are a citizen of the U.S. And that states denying the right to vote will lose their representation in Congress. This was opposed again by President Johnson and the Southerners, but it was ratified by the Congress controlled by Republicans and radical Republicans in 1868. So what we're seeing here is a real split between President Johnson's version of Reconstruction and what Congress wants to do. So our Lesson 40 thoughts. How did Presidents Lincoln and Johnson differ with the radical Republicans on how the former Confederate states should be treated during Reconstruction? Why do you think that many Southern whites resisted efforts to extend civil rights and freedoms to African Americans? And finally, summarize the 13th and 14th Amendments. What effect do you predict these will have on African Americans during Reconstruction? In fact, it would be a really good idea if you would either find online or in your textbook, read the text of the 13th and 14th Amendments and see exactly what they say. All right, that concludes this lesson, and we'll see you back for the next one, Reform in the South.